fair, but at the same time, I think it's quite it's quite nice to have a change, I reckon. You know.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think that we have a great team here of people, and there's lots of really cool stuff that we can do for geosciences in Southern Africa. So I'm excited.
Yeah, well, you've got a lot of good analytical equipment that they didn't have years ago, haven't you? You know, the labs you've really got those labs going nicely now, from what I hear. You know.
Yeah, we've got, and your samples are in the queue. So
I was just about to say,
forgotten about them.
We better not talking about outstanding isotopic analyses. You know,
they haven't been forgotten. Don't worry.
Don't worry, you've only had them about 5 years. There's no hurry.
The problem is that we had them before the labs all moved, and so that's always been the difficult thing. But the good thing about that for you is that you'll get much better quality isotope data now than you would have 4 years ago.
Like, Grant, honestly, I'm not worried. It's fine. If I had the data, I wouldn't even be able to write it up. I've got a bit of a queue of things I'm meant to be working on, so it's actually fine. Yeah.
Good.
And the strange thing is, I'm convinced that these isotopes in the Bushveld, you know, show bugger all. So, which is another story, isn't it? You know. So
yeah.
Mm.
Okay, Roger. Well, I'm gonna actually just quickly pop to the loo, and then I'm gonna get a drink, and we'll enjoy your talk. I can see a bunch of people joining online, which is great.
Yeah, I see Spike. I see Spike's just joined, which is nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I'll introduce you, Roger, as well. So
okay,
I'll see you in a few minutes.
A nice short introduction. I don't like these long, glowy things.
No, but I especially wrote up 2 pages.
Oh no!
I'm teasing. I didn't.
Good.
I'll just use your biography that you sent through.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, see you shortly, Roger.
Great. Cheers. Thank you.
Okay, Roger, are you almost ready to
Yep,
go?
I'm here. Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll just give it maybe 1 more minute.
Okay.
We'll start.
I can see about 4 or 5 people on. Is that all there is?
No, there's 20 people online, and we have about 10 people in the audience so far here, but they'll trickle in shortly.
Oh, I didn't realize you did that, Grant. I'm glad you told me. So you sort of stream it into the lecture room, do you? Or the tea
Oh
room?
yes, yeah. So we it's hybrid. So we have people here in the room.
Oh, that's
Unfortunately,
very nice.
you just can't see them, but you'd have to trust me that they're here.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
But there are also about 20 people online as well.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So which room do you use? You used to use 101, didn't you?
Yeah, it's the same. It's exactly the same room.
Okay. Now I've given a couple of, I think maybe 2 or 3 lectures there. I think.
Okay.
But the last one I gave, Spike introduced me, so which was
Okay.
quite good memories. Yeah. Yeah. And you defended me when I got attacked as well, which was also very nice.
Okay.
That's good. You have good memories of the positive bits. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think let's begin. Certainly, we've got a good online audience and fairly good audience in the room, especially for a vacation week break here at Wits. So thank you everyone for joining us, and most especially thank you to Roger Scoon for joining us for this GeoTalk. You can see his title there, and very briefly, Roger's asked me to give a very brief bio. So Roger grew up in the UK, currently lives in Neisner, and he completed his doctorate at Rhodes University, and during that process, he developed a passion for the Bushveld Complex, for chromite and platinum deposits of the Bushveld, and was a mine geologist for a long time, but also a passionate researcher focusing on the Bushveld. But what you also might know Roger for is his incredible geotourism work that he's done throughout the world, basically. And if you read the Geo Bulletin, every month there is, or whenever it's published, there is an article that Roger produces based on his travels to exotic geological locations. And he's got several books based on those travels, and it's a fantastic educational guide to the geology of the world, basically. So I think the society appreciates Roger's work in that regard particularly. But tonight he's going to be speaking not about that, but about the Bushveld Complex and the petrogenesis of aspects of the marginal zone and the lower zone. So Roger, over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Grant. It's a very kind introduction, and yeah, it's quite nice to speak on the Bushveld. I feel it's more home turf. When I gave some lectures up to in Kenya last year to a lot of the rangers and the guides who run the tours there, and you know, it was interesting struggling with a lot of the pronunciations of some of the local names, and I thought, nice, you know, sort of making sure I got my geography correct as much as my geology. So it's a lot easier being on the Bushveld. So yeah, this is a talk with Andrew Mitchell, as you'll see in the next slide, on the lower zone and the marginal rocks. The picture on the left is some layered peridotites at the bottom, where there's magnesite developed and bronzitites or pyroxenites at the top. And the picture on the right, I guess a lot of people would know the outcrop is one of the classic lower marginal zone localities. Of course, what we didn't do is we didn't try to advance the slide. So I don't know if it's, oh no, it's moving. Yep. So the full title is a player. You can probably just read for yourself. And the idea is that the model we're pushing is very much outside of the magma chamber idea. We believe that igneous layering developed incrementally, and we also believe there's evidence of syn-magmatic sills, peridotite sills in particular, in these rocks as well. And it's published in the local journal. So I'll give a little comment to the GSSA though. I think the journal is extremely high standard publications, and I must say, dealing with the editors and the referees and the whole layout was a pleasure. And our work has been focused on the eastern limb, shown on the map there on the right, in the essentially area outlined in red, very much the northern sector of the eastern limb. And because one of the advantages of working in the eastern limb is the outcrop. This is a view site, a very well-known view site off the main road linking Burgersfort or would eventually go all the way through to Polokwane. And as you can see, there's the lower zone is those rather rugged hills in the middle of the picture, middle distance, with the outcrop off to the left of the slide. The marginal rocks are also make quite substantial hills here as well. The marginal rocks are thicker than one would possibly imagine. And then the red line, dotted line to indicate the contact with the floor rocks, which is dipping relatively steeply here. Critical zone off to the left, and I make a little bit of mention of the lower critical zone in the talk, but that's a separate story to some extent. And I think many of you would know that the sort of normal stratigraphic column, the different zones. The big difference is we prefer the description marginal sill phase to marginal zone. We don't see it really as a zone. We believe that's a little bit of a misnomer, but it's a small point really. And just showing you that we're focusing on the marginal rocks, the lower zone, and a little bit of the lower critical zone. And the idea being is that on this section, the basal contact of the Bushveld is markedly transgressive, maybe much more so than may well be commonly appreciated. If we look at a more detailed map of the eastern limb, you can see that the marginal rocks shown in the grey are persistent along almost the entire strike length, even around these upwarps in the floor rocks, let alone these trough-like structures. They come all the way around down to this Burgersfort area. So that's a key observation, that the marginal sill phase, or the marginal rocks, to say it in a simpler way, are laterally persistent. But the lower zone is, I think everybody who's studied the Bushveld at all, or even if you've just done some courses as students at university, you probably appreciate that the lower zone is restricted to just 3 troughs or subchambers. And these are the chambers, the Burgersfort one in the south, the lower zone shown in this rather shiny green, and then the Clapham chamber, which is where Alan Wilson, who's now at Wits, of course, published a couple of very detailed papers recently, and also in the Oliphants River area, which is where Eugene Cameron did a lot of the pioneering work back in the 70s and early 80s. And of course, without these publications, an article like this wouldn't have arisen. We're completely reliant here. We haven't produced any new data other than descriptive information on the field relationships. We're very reliant on the published work. And then a key point of this is that the domes and the upwarps actually play a major role in how you interpret these rocks. So the biggest upwarp could be called the Steelport structure, which is essentially a big structural disrupted area down here. There's a big dome at a locality called Oosterkeluk, which I've written a paper on some years ago. There's a Steelport pericline, which Willemse worked on back in the 50s, I would guess. Martin Sharp and Brendan Clark have published detailed work on it as well. And then there's there's an upwarp between the Burgersfort and Clapham Tross called the Derdig Galid upwarp, another upwarp here, Schwerin, and then, oopsie, there was another upwarp there. I won't go back, don't worry. We'll see this in another slide. So if we look at the marginal sill phase, just in a simplistic way, we've chosen the name to be inclusive of both the marginal zone and the syn-Bushveld sills. We don't really see too much difference between these features. And maybe the name will actually help people get away from imagining these rocks are formed in a magma chamber. So as I said before, the idea was that it's persistent along strike, but of course the thickness is very variable. And it's generally subdivided into peroxenitic and noritic components, but we specifically exclude the peridotites. We believe they represent a separate event, and that's maybe the most important bit of the talk. and the paper, that we've taken the peridotites out of the marginal zone and present them as a separate entity altogether. And of course, some of the rocks in the marginal zone are somewhat exotic. This is a rock which is generally described as a rheomorphic breccia at the Hendriksplatz locality, which many people would visit on bushwhack trips. It's essentially on the contact with the impure quartzites, the Steenkamp quartzites, which are partially melted. And then on the right is the well-known tennis ball marker, which is another exotic lithology in the marginal zone, which Andrew and I have written a paper on in the same journal in the December issue. So they don't really affect us because they're specialized components of the marginal rocks. But if we look at probably the better view site, this is on the farm to Grooteboom, where the road leads up from Dwars River. So I generally just call it the Dwars River Pass. I'm not sure if it's got a particular name. And you can see the marginal rocks are exposed in the foreground on the photograph, you know, with the upper critical zone and the norites of the lower main zone in the distance. You don't really see the lower critical zone on this photograph. And in this area, the marginal rocks contain large calc-silicate xenoliths. There's a picture from a few years back, Maurice Viljoen examining the darker rocks, of course, are the marginal pyroxenites and norites, and the lighter rocks are the big calc-silicates. And in actual fact, Martin Sharp describes this area very clearly, that the marginal zone looks extremely wide on the map, but it's hard to say whether you're in the floor rocks or in the bushveld half the time because of the interfingering of the two groups of rocks. And of course, you know, on the picture on the right, we see quite clearly where you've got noritic and pyroxenitic components. They generally make separate sills, but in some localities, particularly here, they can be complexly intercalated. And we'll have a look at that a bit later on. If we look at the rock types in the lower zone, clearly a completely different story. As just to repeat, it's restricted to these localized subchambers in the northern sector. In fact, it doesn't occur in the southern sector or the western sector of the eastern limb at all. It's entirely ultramafic. That's really the definition of it. And again, you get two discrete lithologies. You get orthoperoxenites, traditionally known as bronzitite, which I think is rather a nice descriptive word. And then you get peridotites. These are photographs from the Clapham Trough. The picture, this one on the left, is the international geologist on the IGC trip in 2016, which I took to that area, looking at some of the pyroxenites which make the hill slopes. And you can see from the picture, the other two photographs, the peridotites are clearly much more weathered, serpentinized. You get lots of magnesite veining. So the idea is that you do get igneous layering, of course, but there's no stratigraphic markers as such. The picture on the left is one of Morris's photographs that he's provided me over the years. And it is an aerial view, of course, of the Oliphants River Trough, the lower zone. And here you can actually see the subzones which Cameron identified all these years ago, a lower bronzitite subzone making these prominent hills over here. And the Hartsbergite subzone, much more deeply weathered. And there you've got the igneous layering labeled here. These are so the rocks that outcrop across are the more pyroxenitic components of the layering, particularly in the center of the Hartsbergite zone. And then the lighter soil-covered areas are the peridotites. And then there's an upper bronzitite subzone as well. And then the critical zone would start over here in this low-lying land here. And if we look at just some photographs of the bronzitites, they're massive monomineralic rocks. I believe they're the most difficult rocks to explain in the Bushveld. I think they've never been explained properly. These outcrops here in the upper bronzitite subzone. These are these nice angular copies that we saw in that first photograph of the dip slope. And they don't have any modal layering at all, but they have mineral lamination. And that's because the orthoperoxene crystals are lined up to make this fantastic lamination. And if we looked at the Hartsbergite subzone, which would be better off to be described as peridotite subzone, that would be more generic because it's got layers of dunite and layers of Hartsbergite. So there are actually two rock types in the peridotite peridotite compositions. And in fact, there's a third rock type in the subzone because there's bronzitites, as you see in the copy in the background. That's actually part of the subzone. And of course, the peridotites are very easily recognized in the field. Just they're much more deeply weathered, as we said before. You get lots of magnesite veins. You get a reddish nickel magnesium-rich soil. The gullies, as in the top photograph, pick up the layering. So this would actually be igneous layering here. The poikilotic hartsbergites tend to outcrop a little bit more resistant than the dunites, and you can see the oikocryst of orthopyroxene quite clearly in the photograph. And you also get a flower which has it's this very pale greenish plant here, but it has a red flower every now and then. Called Heliochrysum, and that's also one of Morris's pictures, actually. I've never seen it in flower, strangely enough. Okay, now here's a picture of some of the magnesite workings. The magnesites in the lower zone have been quarried, and not to be confused with the quarrying which has been done on some of the intrusions in the floor rocks. And again, Morris making up the scale, looking at magnesite veins. This is in a quarry right next to the main road at Clapham, as is the picture below. And the two pictures on the right showing the development of stigmatic folding and a sort of more linear array of the magnesite in the peridotites. This is also in the Clapham Trough, but it's on a farm called Twyfelaar, a little bit further along the road from the other two pictures. The quarry is on the west side of the road. And then, as I said, we consider the peridotite intrusions and sills as a sort of separate group, so making it almost like a third group of rocks in the talk. And of course, these intrusions and sills are developed mostly in the floor rocks. The biggest and most well-known one is Apis Duran Dry, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think Willemse might have been the first, Professor Willemse from Pretoria was probably one of the first geologists to work on it back in the 50s. And then Martin Sharp's written some very detailed papers, as has Brendan Clark. And this is one of Brendan's photographs from, it's on the internet in his 2009 paper. So this would just be up, next to the small town of Burgersfort, off in the floor rocks to the actual Bushveld itself, and the peridotite outcrops, or subcrops in these low-lying valleys. And that's just a nice big lump of magnesite. And because the magnesite developed on these peridotite intrusions is generally much thicker and better quality than the magnesite in the lower zone. And if we look today a three-dimensional satellite image, this shows you is essentially a view looking north from, as you can see, just it's a locality called De Berge, just below looking up the Dwars River Valley. So Steelport would be over here somewhere. Probably, I think actually the town should be a little bit off to the right a bit. And I'm just showing with these red stars the big trough. So this is the big Burgersfort trough here, and then the Clapham trough is like this, and the Oliphants River trough over here, and they're huge, big indentations in the floor rocks, where the lower zone has developed extensively. And the interesting thing is, the floor contact, of course, is then extremely irregular, as you can see on the photograph. Sorry for that, but the roof contact is much more planar, and to me, this is one of the key features of the Rustenburg layered suite in the Bushveld, that it's a sill-like body with an irregular contact, and the planar nature of the upper contact is really quite a important point. And as I said before, there's these big structural features in the floor rocks. The big Steelport structures here, this would be part of the pericline described by Martin Sharp and others. And then you've got these upwarps between the troughs, but there's also domes, of which I've just labeled a couple, the Fafani dome, and this is the Zyklov dome, which I wrote an article on some years back, which actually come up through the upper zone. So the doming has actually had an impact on the entire development of the Rustenburg layered suite. So if we look at the details of some of the troughs, the first thing to note is the colors hopefully are the same as on the main map. So look, the marginal zone in the gray, or marginal sill phase in the gray, lower zone in the green. So the first thing to notice is that the troughs are not made up only of lower zone. There's a thick development of marginal rocks in each trough, which often is not shown on the maps correctly, but it is shown on the 250,000 maps of the council. I believe those maps are pretty accurate. And so, of course, another key feature here is the peridotites. But I'll look at it. I'll show you another map of that in a moment. And the idea is I cut the column here just to show the layered rocks. So there's the marginal rocks at the bottom. There's a noritic component, and then a pyroxenitic component, and then the lower zone. And the idea here is that the lower zone is almost entirely made up of bronzitites. There's no peridotites that have been mapped or recorded. But having walked some of the hills, there are peridotites, but they're very, very thin, a minor constituent. And if we look to the photograph, this is a view from the Winterfart Chrome mine, sort of looking approximately east, maybe slightly southeast. Anybody who's been there will know this is the town of Steelport, and there's the big Tabaxi ferrochrome smelter. And the quarry is developed on quartzites, which they use as some form of flux in the smelter. So, and the big hills here are the lower zone. But you see, even these hills over here, which is the marginal sill phase, it gives you some idea that the marginal rocks are really quite thick here. And the photograph, and this, by the way, the foreground would be critical zone, lower critical zone. And the picture done on the bottom left, that's a view at the other side of the Burgersfort Trough looking west. And those hills here are made up entirely of the marginal sill phase, according to the geological map. I haven't ever walked on those hills, but I'm sure that's correct. And then the other point, as I mentioned earlier, is that the peridotites tend to underlie the valleys. And then when you see these scarp faces of quartzite, then you know those are floor rocks. So the different rocks make different shaped hills. You can pick them out relatively easily. So if we just return to the same map and look at the peridotites, you can see now that the peridotites are maybe much more extensive, these big intrusive bodies and sills in the floor rocks than maybe realized. The biggest feature is this Apis Duran dry intrusion, which is like an intrusive body over here maybe, which is where the quarries are. But then it includes these very thick sills, which are laterally quite extensive. There's also magnesites being quarried at Apis Duran dry from sills or intrusions over here. And there's this Oliphant's Porky and Glenora intrusion and the Wildebeest-Kral intrusion, all named by Martin Sharp and described in the Harman Sharp paper 1985, and also Sharp and Holbert, I think, might be a more accurate reference for that one. And then if we looked at the column, you can see the intrusive cross-cutting nature of the peridotites, particularly Apis Duran dry intrusion. You know, they're not layered sills as maybe has been portrayed in the literature. Brendan Clark clearly describes them as discordant cross-cutting bodies. And one of the key pieces of evidence is that the sills, the peridotites actually cut into the lower part of the marginal zone, particularly in this area around here. And Martin Sharp has described that as well in some of his field guides rather than in his main papers. And this provided evidence I sort of thought about maybe 20 odd years ago, that the peridotites are actually, they're clearly younger than the marginal zone. Their relative age to the lower zone is difficult to establish, but we believe they would be younger than the lower zone as well. So if we looked at this on some form of longitudinal section, we'd have the Burgersfort Trough here. The brown would be the lower critical zone and the light green. And then the darker shiny green, the lower zone. And here's the marginal rocks at the bottom with some big rafts of quartzite, which are these features shown on the map. And again, Brendan Clark suggests that some of these are actually in situ. And they've just been enveloped into the marginal rock. And there's the Apis Duran intrusion as, you know, great big intrusive body of peridotite in the floor rocks. You know, and some of the sills would connect up to this Apis Duran complex as well. So maybe much more complex than people would have realized. And if we look at the Clapham Trough, we have a similar situation where we've got a reasonably thick marginal sill phase in the gray and the lower zone. Here's the marginal sill phase here. And in this trough, based on Alan Wilson's work, he identified 3 components in the marginal rocks: a melanorite, a noritic layer with a specific xenolithic layer of norite as well, and then a peroxenite, which has often been known as the Clapham peroxenite, and that's been given a formal name by the South African Committee for Stratigraphy. And we've cut the column here on purpose, because we believe that the peridotite, which is shown in this dotted lines here, which Alan recorded as a basal ultramafic sequence, if you like, an extra piece of lower zone in the Bushveld, we believe it's a sill. So we've called it the Mabongwani intrusion on the basis of the name of the valley. And there's another sill actually known as the Wimbledon sill further back in the floor rocks over here. And of course, this Mabongwani intrusion, Alan's basal ultramafic rocks, if you like, is also extremely thick, almost 1,000 meters thick of basically layered peridotites. There's some orthoperoxenites, but most of them are olivine-rich rocks. And if we looked at it on a longitudinal section, we'd see it sitting here, below the marginal rocks, actually in the floor. And one of the evidence, I believe, to suggest it's a sill rather than an extra part of the layered intrusion is that there's a sill called the GEOTALK intrusion or the Driekop intrusion. It's been given different names, which was mined for magnesite over many years, situated on the southern margins of the trough. And I've shown schematically that there's a reasonable chance that they join up. So if we look at the Oliphants River trough, which is often the most well-known one because the outcrops are good, you can see from a satellite image, you can pick up a lot of the layering. There's the marginal rocks here. There's that lower bronzotite subzone. We saw the photograph with the high hills, the Hartsbergite subzone making the valley, and then the upper bronzotite next to the road, the critical zone, and so on. And there are some floor rocks which Cameron mapped in this area, but we interpret them as domes rather than xenoliths. And of course, then you've got the closures of these big folds, the Schwerin upwarp on the east side and the Katkloof dome on the west side. And it just, as you can see on the map, it really does look like a separate subchamber where the trough developed. So if we look at a map, it just really reiterates what we're saying there. And here's the column, the marginal zone at the bottom. Here, the xenolithic norite is at the bottom, which is where one might expect it to be, containing big xenoliths of floor rocks. Then there's what Cameron mapped as a dunite layer, but we have reinterpreted it as a sill. So we've called it the Rostock sill, simply from the outcrops on Rostock. And then there's a relatively thick peroxenitic body in the marginal rocks, which could quite conceivably be the lateral extent of the Clapham peroxenite, and then you've got the layering in the lower zone, which is the only locality where one can define subzones. So there's the lower bronzotite and the Hartsbergite and the upper bronzotite subzone, as we said before. But I think it's been exaggerated in the scientific literature. That these subzones are always present in the lower zone, but we believe they're not. They're of localized significance, which has a key genetic implication. So if we just sort of summarize what we've been saying, if we look at the marginal sill phase first, so we can say the first thing is we can say, well, it's laterally contiguous and there's thick sequences in the troughs. As you can see, Burgersfort trough, Clapham trough, and the Oliphants River trough. There's a xenolithic norite, which is a particular layer, but it's in the Clapham trough, it's mapped in the middle of the marginal zone, not the bottom. So that's a problem to making these things stratigraphic markers. There are rocks, floor rocks, rafts of quartzite, particularly at Burgersfort. There's 2 of them shown here, and one of them, as you can see, divides the norite and the noritic component and the peroxenitic component. And as I said, the Clapham peroxenite and also the Hendrix-Platz norites have been given formal names, and they're quite useful. You can try to plot them up, but I don't believe that you can make them into stratigraphic markers, if you like. So there's a lot of variability, and this precludes establishing an igneous stratigraphy, in my opinion. And I think this slide probably shows quite a lot about the interpretation of the marginal zone. We can explain it by the B1 magma defined by Harmer and Sharp in 1985. And, as they explained quite clearly in their paper, that there's both noritic and peroxenitic components of the B1 magma, but it clearly can't be in situ fractionation. The peroxenitic magma to me looks as if it's intruded into the noritic magma. You can see these sort of flame type textures on the top contact of the layer, but it looks as if the noritic magma was still cooling when it came in, a sort of semi-plastic state, and it's been described as such by Martin and Jock Harmer, and also Brendan Clark's described it as well on some of the folding. And the key is I think people like to put layered intrusions into lots of boxes and explain them all as similar. So if we look at the Skaergaard intrusion, where a lot of the pioneering work was done, particularly by Wager and Deer back in the 1930s, well, there you've got the marginal rocks. You can see on the map is this brown area here coming around, and there's areas it doesn't outcrop. There's that dotted stuff's a glacier, by the way. And you can see it, on the east side of the complex as well here. But when you're down on the southern side, then that dark blue is also marginal rocks, but it's the upper border series rather than the marginal border series. And this is a cross section based on Neil Irvine's field guide in 2001, and a photograph, just the classic layering in the intrusion, and you can see, it's pretty clear that these are chills. They're chills related to the emplacement of a magma chamber. But in the Bushveld, we don't believe there's any resemblance at all. And Andrew and I have decided that, mostly because we know that people like to have comparisons, and it's maybe not such a good thing to keep explaining everything in the Bushveld is different or unique. We believe there is a parallel with the Coolins intrusion in Skye, where I went to a few years ago and got some of these pictures of quite nice igneous layering. You get blocks as well, like you get in Skaergaard, sort of blocks within blocks, as Neil Irvine described some of these features. Well, this is a map of Skye. The Coolins intrusion is here in the purple. That's the mafic component, and then there's a granitic component, which you could compare to the Bushveld granites. And the main difference is that the green are basalt lavas, which would then equate to the Royberg felsite in the Bushveld in terms of age, but not in terms of composition. And I haven't managed to get a cross section, next to a map, and I haven't redrawn it. But the idea is that if you look at the map at the top right, in the mafic rocks of the Coolins, there's an outer marginal group of gabbros, which is shown here in brown, and then at the top there's a thin border unit overlying it. So the border unit is actually not on the perimeter; it's inside, and the border unit is peroxenitic. So it really looks like there's some resemblance to the marginal rocks in the Bushveld, where you've got norites and or gabbros and peroxenites. And then if on a cross section, which is from a sort of field guidebook, a little bit schematic really for the tourist, while the marginal rocks, the border group would fit over here type of thing. And it's clearly explained by Bell and Harris, references in 1986 in the field guide, plus obviously other more detailed, if you like, scientific papers in addition to the guidebook, that the gabbros and the peroxenites were in place before the actual layered rocks, which make up the main layered intrusion. So they said these are precursors to the development of a magma chamber, where you've got ultramafics and actually iron-rich gabbros as well. So if we look at some chemistry of these rocks, just very briefly, this is all data published by Cameron, 1980. We've got the marginal rocks down the bottom with that peridotite sill, and you can see the lower bronzitite, the Hartsbergite subzone, just trying to show in the layering of the peridotite with some bronzitites, the upper bronzitite subzone. So there's only olivine in the peridotite-rich peridotites. There's no olivine in the bronzitites at all. And if you look at the orthoproxene compositions, particularly, there's very, very limited fractionation. And we believe that this is a key piece of information, that the lack of fractionation. When you think how thick that these zones are, if you join these the two bronzitites together, you're talking about 800 meters. We believe it could never ever have crystallized from a big magma chamber, as I guess the sort of mainstream views would think. And of course, and the other thing is to indicate that the bronzitites and the peridotites are completely different rocks. They've got no relationship to each other, because the bronzitites are monomineralic rocks, but there's no chrome spinel in the bronzitites, but there is chrome spinel in the peridotites, the 1 to 2%. So, it's difficult to envisage phase diagrams if they're related to magmatic cycles of crystallizing orthoperoxene and chrome, no chromite down here, and then suddenly crystallizing, much more, crystallizing chrome spinel and having a much higher chromite content when you hit these peridotite magmas. And, I just put down here just to show the average olivine composition, 92 to 88. It's relatively primitive, and that would include the peridotites in the lower zone. Just one example on the diagram, the Rostock sill, the one that we showed before, is a little bit more fractionated than the average. But this would be data from Martin Sharp's work and Alan Wilson's work. So the idea is that the lower zone, you've got these thick sequences. They're in each trough. They're absent from the upwarps, which is a key field observation. So the idea is that that each subzone, each trough developed as a separate subchamber, and they were never ever connected. So that the subzones at Oliphant's River, there's 3 subzones we've now mentioned quite often, you can't then go and transfer them along to the Burgess Fort subzone, for example, and expect to find the same stratigraphy. So there's no marker layers, and each trough has a unique igneous stratigraphy. Whereas, of course, when you're in the lower critical zone, upper critical zone, then those sequences are much more laterally transgressive. And here we've shown the full Burgess Fort column to show you how thick the peridotites are at the base. And you can see, the peridotites at Clapham, which we're interpreting as a sill, I think it works better than this, having a localized stratigraphy. These are younger rocks than the overlying rocks, which have, developed in the floor. And just to quickly mention a tiny little bit on the lower critical zone, this is some columns that we've established for the northern sector, and the majority of the lower critical zone, this is Cameron's way of dividing it, the B, C, and D and E units. The majority of it is pyroxenites, shown in brown, but there's 2 peridotite units, the C1 and the C3. And if you prefer the nomenclature that's used in the Western limb, well, the C1 would correlate with the LG2 chromites, and the C3 would be the LG4 chromites. And this is the picture on the right is some data from Mark Bristow's PhD, 1989, which we've just in the process of writing up together with Mark, and hopefully we'll finish and publish the paper quite soon, just showing some details of the C3 unit. And we believe that these trends of the most magnesium-rich compositions for both the olivine and the pyroxene are actually found in the center of the unit, and the more fractionated material at the bottom and the top, which to us is suggests that it's a syn-magmatic sill. So if we look at parental magmas, it's something I've never written on, and I always try to shy away from, because I believe a lot of the information is completely misconstrued. And I'm at one stage with Gabby Costin he's based in Houston now. He moved over from Rhodes some years ago. We've been talking for a number of years to try to put something together to quantify, but just until we've done that, I have to keep it very general discussions of the sills. We can obviously use the UNA magmas of Sharp and Irvine, or the B1, B2, B3 magmas of Harmer and Sharp. But the point that Andrew and I have emphasized for many years that these are broad lineages of magmas. They're not specific compositions, which we believe has been a bit misconstrued in the literature. So if we look at the marginal sill phase, well, yeah, we can use the B1 magma if we like, or a combination of A and U. But there's clearly neritic magmas and there's pyroxenitic magmas. You know, there's not fractionation in a magma chamber. There's separate pulses of magma which have been intruded into the upper crust. And if we go to the lower zone, yep, they're U magmas. Well, everybody would agree with that. And it's unrealistic to conflate with the B1 lineage, which is what Timer and Sharp suggested. They had the peridotite magmas in with the neritic and pyroxenitic magmas, which seems a bit, not a very satisfactory approach for me. But the key where I think Andrew and I differ from the mainstream views is we suggest there's two magmas in the lower zone, not one. There's orthoproxene saturated magmas and there's peridotitic magmas. So just to look why we would say that, well, the bronzitites, as I said before, they're very anomalous rocks. They're monomineralic. You can see in the, this is a bit of a lousy picture, but it just shows the face of one of a pyroxenite slab in the bush. Orthoproxene makes up about 98.5 modal percent. Oh yeah, there we are. I wrote it down. Plagin CPX. There's no chrome spinel. There's no olivine. So we believe that you have to postulate some rather unusual orthopyroxene saturated parental magma. And if we look at the peridotites, and it doesn't matter now whether we're talking about the peridotites from the floor rocks or the lower zone, well, we get dunites, which are almost monomineralic olivine rocks, but then they're relatively easy to explain by fractionation processes, and they would fractionate to produce a poikilotic harzpigite shown in the slide on the bottom right. And you can imagine a fractionation sequence, which I've shown here, simply layers of dunite fractionate to poikilotic granular harzpigite olivine orthoproxenite. And this would be one of the harzpigites from a sill, and actually one of the sills connected to Apis durandrai, which a friend of mine, Anton Esterhazen, was exploring for nickel some years back. So we went to look at some of the coral. So if we try to put the whole thing together, we have a longitudinal section for this northern sector of the eastern limb. And you can see how there's a lower zone in the Burgess Fort Trough, the Clapham Trough, the Oliphants River Trough, the peridotites, as you've seen before, actually making these big intrusive bodies and sills in the floor rocks. But the key to some extent, which I think has been a little bit misconstrued, is how the marginal zone shown in this very pale gray here, we changed the shade of gray, which is a bit silly, is actually continuous along the whole sequence. And the idea is that there's thick sequences of marginal zone in the troughs, but tectonically thin sequences on the crests of the upwarps. And that's because the troughs developed during formation of the lower zone due to emplacement of the ultramafic magmas, which has been widely described before our contribution. And essentially, we have a whole load of basal discordances between the different rock units, and we believe that each basal discordancy equates with an intrusive hiatus, which throws a very different light on the interpretation of these sequences compared to the magma chamber idea. And just to sort of throw a little bit on the lower critical zone into the game, we decided that we could divide it on the B to D1 units. If you remember that column before, the lower group of units in the light green, and then the upper group 2 unit D2 and E in the brown. And you can see that the lower group is thickly developed in the troughs, and that's the sort of cross sections or the columns that you might see in papers. But when you're on the crest of these upwarps, such as is at the Moyhook locality, these sequences are much thinner and they're quite disruptive. And that also obviously clearly adds a different interpretation onto the lower critical zone as well. So if we think of the chronology of what we're talking about, we're identifying 3 completely separate magmatic events, if you like. Intrusion of the B1 neritic pyroxenitic magmas would be the first one. Magmas are intruded from deep staging chambers. They're emplaced in the floor rocks or between the floor and the Royberg felsites. And this means that the marginal sill phase isn't a chill, it's a sequence of stacked sills. It's a precursor to the Rustenburg layered suite, definitely not a chill in our opinion. And the sills, of course, can be fractionated. Like, Martin Sharp describes compositions from enstatite 90 to 66. So we're talking a big range of magmas. The idea that the B1 is one or two fixed compositions is clearly incorrect. And of course, the sills, not only they might be fractionated, they can also be non-sequential, which would be expected in a complex of stacked sills. So when people have taken samples and they try to produce very detailed analytical data to argue that these are the parental magmas to the Salem-Rensky Reef or whatever it is they're trying to model, we just don't see that. If you could be in the middle of a fractionated sill, or you could be on, maybe going across contacts or whatever. It's a far more complicated picture, I believe, than people have allowed for. And of course, the real argument is that these sills don't really have much the composition doesn't really give much of a clue to the layered rocks which are overlying them. So in the case of the lower zone, as we've said now, the second of the chronological events would be the intrusion of ultraperoxene saturated magmas. And because of the lack of differentiation, and we cannot reconcile like data of Camerons with a big magma chamber, we would suggest that you've had an incremental accumulation of bronzitite from lots and lots of thin pulses of magma sort of feeding in slowly. So the composition is really fixed to the magma composition. And then the third event, a separate younger event, would be intrusion of the peridotitic magmas. And these magmas crystallize initially as intrusions and sills in the floor rocks, clearly to us fed through a completely different set of feeders to the other magmas. And then some of the sills stepped up to higher levels and intruded the earlier form layered rocks of the marginal sulfides, the lower zone bronzitites, and even the lower critical zone to make the peridotites higher up in the sequence. And we believe that that's a much simpler model than having everything sequentially developed, because those peridotites have similar compositions. So the conclusions are that the igneous layering developed incrementally from successive intrusive events. Magmas were injected as thin sheets, even magma laminae rather than large pulses. We have syn-magmatic sills, particularly the peridotites. Offers an alternative explanation for units ascribed to magmatic cycles. And we think equilibrium or near equilibrium crystallization are the key phases, as the key processes. There's only very minor evidence of in situ fractionation. So all the fractionations happened at depth. And this means that we have to appeal to radical switches in the compositions of the parental magmas to explain zonal boundaries and geochemical discontinuities rather than processes in a magma chamber. Then another key finding, which is something which has intrigued me for many, many years, and that I picked it up to some extent from trips of Andrew to look at some of the platinum deposits in the Urals in Russia, where the Russian geologists have similar views that the ultramafic magmas were intruded after the initial mafic magmatism. And in the article, we've quoted one of Guni Marsh's papers on some of the Karoo intrusive bodies, where he came to a similar conclusion, but many years ago before we came to this position. So maybe that may well be a more general process, and it's obviously repeated in the Coolins intrusion in Scotland as well, where the mafic magmas came in before the peridotite magmas. And then, of course, a key point as well is that the field relationships are very important, and it's the uplift of the floor rocks and the early formation of some subchambers places significant constraints on how we interpret these components of the Rustenburg layered suite. It might not affect interpretations of the main zone and the upper zone as much, but it's clearly got a big impact on how we interpret the marginal rocks, the lower zone, the lower critical zone. So finally, the key evidence, I suppose, that we're trying to push is that there's little or no evidence of a shallow crystal magmatic reservoir or a large crystal mush. So it's really, if you like, trying to throw out a lot of more conventional views on the development of these rocks and go, try to get a new look at the whole story, if you like. And these are some of the key references, and I just put them up because it's obviously important to reference people's work, particularly, these. There are obviously other references, but these are the most important ones by Eugene Cameron, Brendan Clark, Jock Harmer, Martin Sharp, and Alan Wilson, because without their data, and the geochemical data is clearly very important. Without that geochemical data and also their field mapping in many cases, we couldn't have put together this story. So that's the talk, and thank you very much. I appreciate everybody listening. And just one slide to finish off, just a little bit advertising, just to mention that we've got this field excursion as part of the Marinsky Reef Conference coming up in August. And, it'd be great to have a lot of people from Wits and, Joe with Pretoria geologists coming along. And we've got quite a nice program lined up to look at some of the dunite pipes. That's the Ondrovaart pipe, many of you might know, on the top right, showing, where you can actually see part of the core zone sort of tonguing out into the dunite in the big glory hole, the outcrop of the GCOP pipe as well. And then probably the highlight of the whole trip is to actually go and look at we should hopefully get access to the underground workings on the Marinsky Reef at Vinasuk. It's been approved by the mining company. So hopefully that will all go ahead. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Roger, thank you for that fantastic talk, very compelling field evidence for some very interesting ideas. So let's open up the floor for questions, either online or in the room. I see there's already a hand raised by Lou Ashwell. So Lou, feel free to unmute and go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Roger, for a very remarkably articulate talk and beautifully illustrated. So I thank you for that.
Thank you.
I agree with pretty much everything you've said. I have no complaints about anything, but I wanted to question you about the very last sentence in your very last slide. Threw me a bit for a loop because it said something like no evidence for large-scale crystal mush. And up until that point, I would have thought that you would be a proponent of the idea that these intrusive bodies, including your sills, have to be crystal-rich slurries or mushes of some kind, and your mineral composition data would support that. And it agrees with my impressions of some of the big zones, like the main zone. All of the anorthosites in the main zone, I think, are similar in terms of they have to be crystal mushes because the compositions don't change over hundreds and hundreds of meters. And so I can't think of any way to avoid fractionation unless they're crystal mushes. Would you care to comment on this issue?
Yeah, no, Lou, thanks for your kind comments. It's nice to get a positive response. I think what I was really trying to say was to try to get away from the concept of the bushveld, particularly the zones that we've looked at. Let's just say, let's not worry about the other zones so much, but just the bit that we've looked at in detail in this contribution, that it was actually either a liquid magma chamber or a big pile of crystals, if you like, so, but if you envisage that these little increments of magma coming in are going to be, they have to be, by the weird compositions, they're going to have to be full of crystals, then we're speaking essentially the same language. It was just maybe a clumsy sentence I put up on the slide, but I don't see that there's sort of, in the case of the bronzitites, remember, if we're saying that the peridotites in the Oliphants River trough are syn-magmatic sills, well, then logically the lower and the upper bronzitite, which have the identical composition, they were originally joined and it was one thick column. I don't think it's feasible to imagine that you've got 800 meters of crystal mush. I believe that, and this is a model that Andrew and I have sort of worked out over the years, is that, we're feeding in the magmas almost like lava flows, as thin laminae, like half a meter, a couple of meters at a time. And so that the lower bits would have been fully crystalline long before the upper bits formed. That's really what I was trying to say. But the actual magma pulses themselves, they must have been full of crystals, because otherwise you could never get these compositions.
Great, thank you, Lou.
Yeah, I think for my thinking on the main zone and elsewhere is look, you've got 1,000 meters of anorthosite with no change in mineral composition, and so that has to be mushes. But whether or not it's one intrusion of kilometer thick of mush, I doubt that very much. I think there are probably hundreds and hundreds of small layered intrusive bodies into the same thing.
Small pulses, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, the problem is to distinguish the boundaries of these pulses. It's not so easy. Sue Webb has done some work on this issue, and she's defined very subtle variations in density, with density increasing upward, and you really can't see it in outcrops or in thin sections. You have to really look in detail at the density variation. So I'm happy with hundreds of pulses of mush being emplaced.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we're thinking reasonably similar lines. I've never fully understood the main zone, I have to be honest. My colleague Andrew Mitchell is a sort of expert on the main zone from my point of view, and he would be in a much better position to comment. But the one thing I can say is that we have published on some of the anorthosite layers, and there's a lot of fractionation in those anorthosite layers. So I'm not so sure it's correct to say that they've got the same composition. The giant mottled anorthosite, the one at the boundary of the critical main zone, I mean the pyroxene, the small interstitial clinopyroxene in the mottles, I think from memory it trends from compositions. The MgF ratio might change from about 80 to about 62 just through the through that one layer. So there's clearly a lot of fractionation going on in the interstitial phase. It might not be in the plagioclase. But Andrew's also published a paper which I think has been overlooked a little bit, that maybe you might like to have a look at. It's in the journal, possibly in '97. It's Mitchell and Manthry, and he believes a lot of the development of the anorthosites is related to remelting. So I'm not sure how comfortable you are with that, but that's, I have no input on that at all, and it's outside the scope of this talk anyway. So, but just to sort of, maybe give you a different view to look at as well.
Thanks, Roger. I could continue this forever, but let somebody else have a chance to question you.
Yeah, you can always email.
Thank you, Lou.
You can always email me or phone me privately. It's it's fine. Talking about the bushvelt's always a pleasure.
Okay.
There's lots of hands popping up from various people around the world. So let's go to Scott, who's not somewhere else. He's in South Africa, I think.
Hey there, yes, I'm just in Johannesburg. Yeah, sorry, but that was a great talk. I kind of had two questions. One was, you didn't really focus much of your talk on this, but I was a bit curious about your emplacement model for these ultramafic sills, where it seemed to me like you were saying that the trough architecture was essentially, like, if I understood your model correctly, you had these highs were basically moving upwards while the ultramafic magmas were being emplaced as sills. Is that correct? And kind of one other question is which is not really which is not exactly relevant, but it might be interesting to think about, is, people I wonder if anybody's thought much about the CO2 sequestration potential of these peridotites and dunites. Like, you see all those magnesite veins. I'm curious if you've thought much about that in terms of, like, that's what a lot of people around the world are trying to do right now, right? Is turn olivine into magnesite and do CO2 sequestration.
Yeah, no, interesting question, Scott. Thank you. I haven't thought much about it, but there's clearly a fair bit of CO2 in the Bushveld. And in actual fact, you know, as a sort of warning, we had a drill hole blowout on the Vinasuk project where I was the exploration manager back in the late 90s for drilling for the Marula Platinum mine. And we hit a pocket of CO2 gas, which I imagine is from these either from the, you know, the calc-silicate xenoliths or the peridotites, you know, so it clearly is potentially a problem. But no, I haven't thought in the way that you're talking about so much. But yeah, I think the point about the troughs, I just went back to put the slide on. You know, the idea is that the troughs have developed during the formation of the ultramafics in the lower zone. That was established by, I would imagine, Willemse many, many years ago, and talked about by Martin Sharp a lot as well. I picked it up from Martin, actually, when Martin took me on my first couple of bushveld trips. You know, so, and the upwarps, the doming and the upwarping is almost continuous, because you can see just on this diagram that the upwarps at, say, up Moyhook in the middle of the picture here, they've disrupted the lower bit of the lower critical zone. But the big steel port structure, that's disrupted even into the upper critical zone. And the paper I wrote on the Zykloof dome is in Economic Geology 2001 or something. You know, that shows that it's disrupted the upper zone. And in fact, in that same paper, I described domes which have gone into the granite. So now whether the uplift can keep going when the granite's coming in is a moot point. But that's what the field evidence would tell you. And in actual fact, that Zykloof dome paper was one of the reasons I postulated 20 years ago that the upper zone is a separate intrusive event, separate magmas, which I believe is now becoming quite popular. So at the time, it was considered to be very far-fetched and wild. But, you know, it's basically because you can see that you've got discordant contacts as these domes keep on growing. So, yeah, you know, there's no doubt these domes are growing. You know, the domes are pushing up as the troughs are pushing down. But our main feeling is that the peridotites come in after that and haven't had too much impact on the doming and the troughing. But we could be wrong on that. I mean, it's hard enough to get a general model out when you're going against mainstream thinking to have too much detail. Other structural geologists could come along maybe and, you know, dot the I's and cross the T's from a structural point of view, you know.
And sorry, maybe just one quick thing to follow up then is, would you then think that these ultramafic magmas could potentially be somewhat late in the magmatic history of the complex, or they're still pretty early?
Well, they're relatively early, but what we're saying is they're following the marginal zone. You know, the marginal zone was there first, the noritic and the pyroxenitic, the mafic magmas, the B1, if you like. And then the orthoperoxene, the bronzitites, well, they're just strange rocks. But then the peridotites came in, you know, the way we've shown it, third on the list, if you like. But, you know, the peridotites, there are peridotites, as I showed you on that one picture in the lower critical zone. So, you know, they're still forming there in the lower critical zone. You know, these are the peridotite sills here. So obviously, no, we don't know the age of the age, whether they came in after these, say, after the E unit had formed, or whether they came in only after the D1 unit had formed. We're not sure. But we've postulated for many years in our papers on the dunite pipes that the peridotites, they're also making dunite pipes. And there's a dunite, there's what the Vinasuk dunite pipe is in the main zone. So, you know, that's intruding into norites of the main zone. So then, of course, you can imagine it has to be intrusive. There's no way it can be some form of transform like people wanted years ago, because, you know, to transform a leuconorite into a dunite is too far-fetched, you know. So, you know, we would suggest it's a rejuvenation of these peridotitic magmas as the Bushveld is continuing. But of course, it's still relatively early in the whole thermal history, because the main zone and the upper zone still have to come. So, you know, we're saying that some of the rocks are out of sequence, some rocks, but not the main zones. I think the main zones are clearly in sequence. You know?
Super. Let's move on to Nick Arndt.
Yeah, Roger, yeah, thanks. Very nice talk. Quick comment first about carbon sequestration. Ewan Nisbet was talking about this many decades ago. He said his idea was you'd capture CO2 from the thermal power stations and mix it with the ultramafic rocks on the dumps around the mine and do it that way. I don't think he's ever published this, but that, the idea has been thought about. But questions. What is the state of the magma into which the sills were intruded? Was it liquid or mush already, or partly or completely solidified? And why did it intrude as sills instead of mixing rather incoherently with the pre-existing material? What were the controls on the lateral intrusion of these sills?
Yeah, well, the first bit of your question, I actually went with Morris V. Ewan and Ewan Nisbet. We went on a Barberton trip many, many years ago. It was quite a nice memory when you mentioned Ewan's name. I haven't seen him for many years. It was really, really good fun. Yeah, no, he was a interesting guy to talk to as well. And well, we would say that they're sills because they're being emplaced into the rocks which are already crystalline, and so that,
already crystalline. Okay,
absolutely, yeah. And they're otherwise there would be mixing, and there's sharp contacts on all of these rocks, which is why they've always really been considered to be magmatic cycles. We're going against the grain to say that these peridotite are actually syn-magmatic sills. But I just don't see any evidence that they can be cycles. And I think in the lower critical zone, the evidence is even stronger than in the lower zone, because they're the peridotites. They're just emplaced in thick sequences of rocks that we call feldspathik peroxidites, which are really melanorites. Yeah. So it's because there's a lack of modal variation and a lack of any chemical fractionation in the host rocks, the peroxenitic host rocks. I think that's maybe the key evidence.
Okay. But then I'm intrigued by Lou's comment, the main zone, it's a very thick interval with constant composition. And I have trouble seeing that forming by multiple injections of sills, simply because I don't understand why the composition of each new slurry coming in would have the same composition. It seems a little...
Well, I think our model is actually better for that, because that's what we're saying. We're saying that we're not switching the hot water and cold water taps off and on. We're saying that you put the peroxenitic rocks in first, and then you put in the peridotites. So the peridotites are actually simply related to the floor rocks. As I said, they make these big intrusions like Arpisdur and Dry first of all. And then they step up, to intrude the marginal zone. Say, here there's that Krutik intrusion goes into the marginal zone, and then they step up even further and go into the lower zone, and then step up again and go into the lower critical zone, not shown on the diagram. And I think that's a much more simplistic model than you're changing. You're changing.
I thought Lou was talking about the main zone or the upper zone where you have.
Well, the main zone, look, each zone is different. I think generalizations in the Bushveld are extraordinarily dangerous. So I think the main zone is a very different beast. Now, I could never imagine an anorthosite being an intrusive sill. I think Lou knows much more about anorthosites than I do, but I would have thought, anorthositic magmas have, the rheology would just be against it. To us, it's quite easy to envisage a peridotitic magma being a sill. We published this first of all for the Marinsky Reef, that the Marinsky Reef is a syn-magmatic sill many years ago. And I think it works for ultramafic magmas, but I can't see it ever work for anorthositic rocks. The anorthosites are very, very complicated. And I must say, I think it's a big generalization and simply not right to suggest that the composition is the same, in each anorthosite. I think they're very complicated rocks. There's a lot of fractionation going on in the interstitial melt, maybe not in the plagioclase itself. And as I said before, and my colleague Andrew Mitchell's published that a lot of these rocks and the textures can be explained by episodes of remelting. So, and I think that's been overlooked basically. And I think the models that we've got of magmas, a lot of magmas coming in, as opposed to a big chamber, you can imagine every time you push in new magmas, you're going to start, potentially, remelting the rocks next to the layer of magma which is coming in.
Okay, some great discussion. We've got one more question from the room, I think, that we should get from Ben Hayes.
Hi there, Roger. Thanks very much for your presentation.
Oh, hi, Ben. Yep, good to hear from you.
I must say, I do like the characterization of the marginal sill phase that you presented. Just in the context of that sort of framework you set out, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on the locations of the major feeders to the eastern limb, and where you would place them in sort of the context of this framework that you've just presented.
Well, there's a good question, isn't it? And feeders, Norris Vierne tried to publish something on feeders on the western limb as well, based essentially on gravity highs. Yeah, the feeders is a big issue, isn't it? You know, so I've never thought too much about it, but it seems logical that the feeders for the ultramafic rocks are the troughs. I think each trough has been fed separately, but I would imagine the feeders for the marginal zone, you know, are completely different. You know, they're sills emplaced in the Transvaal sequence, and as you can see, they pushed along laterally, you know, for possibly 100 kilometers. So I think I'd be happy having different groups of feeders. And I think the igneous lamination in the bronzitite in the Olifants River section, I'm sure you've seen it on one of your trips. You know, I mean, to me, that just shows that the magmas are coming up from you know, the interior of the Transvaal Basin, if you like. You know, they're coming up from it's just the interior of the basin, and that's preserving, you know, that foliation is preserving the direction of the magma flow. But I think, you know, the key is that the real answer to your question is that the feeders to the Bushveld is a bit of an unresolved issue, I would suggest. Yeah. We need to, you know, look at much more detailed geophysical evidence to go with the geological evidence as well.
Right. Well, thank you so much for the fantastic discussion. This has been great. I suggest that there's a few questions in the chat as well. Perhaps those people can stay on the Zoom call afterwards, and we can develop the discussion some more. But I think there's some people who also need to get transport to go home. So thank you all for coming. It's a great audience, a great discussion. Thank you, Roger. And next week's talk follows on really well from your talk, in fact, because we have Janine Cole from the Council of Geoscience, who's going to be speaking on geophysical evidence for sub-staging chambers to the Bushveld. So that sounds good. A great follow-on. And thank you once again, Roger. Much appreciated.
No, thank you, Grant. And thanks for all the questions and everything. It was very nice. Yeah.
Alan, would you like to come through and ask your question with Roger, and we can have a little discussion afterwards?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sitting in a McDonald's because I'm on my way to Texas to see the eclipse.
Oh, wow. Great. We really are all around the world, eh?
Yes. And they tell me I